urgent. While the Kremlin hypocritically talks about reconciliation, Ukraine is waiting for 3 million shells, and Trump has finished the game. Russia wants all of Ukraine. We'll have to forget. The US president threatens with tough sanctions, and a meeting with Putin could be very soon. Meanwhile, the Russian dictator gave a new interview. And again, not a word about peace. But for the first time, Putin spoke about a future without himself. The Kremlin is shaking. Who is preparing for the battle for power? Stay tuned. Ukraine does not want war, but at the same time, must be strong. This was stated by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, at a press conference in the Czech Republic.
We believe that without increasing pressure, Russia will not take real practical steps to end the war.
In a new interview with propagandist Pavel Zarubin, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin effectively confirmed that Russia maintains its original goals in its war in Ukraine, which are tantamount to capitulation despite negotiations with the United States. In the conversation, Putin mentioned another thing that was not expected to be heard.
He plans once again to use the mechanism of a successor. But in reality, I wouldn't really count on that. I think that, in fact, he is manipulating this topic again. Because it's hard to imagine that Putin is stepping away from power, handing it over to someone.
Zelensky noted that another priority task is to force Russia to agree to a complete and unconditional ceasefire, as proposed by the United States. And in his opinion, Europe and the US can help with this by exerting pressure.
Putin is only manipulating the topic of ending the war. That is, the Russian leadership has identified a certain weakness. In particular, this weakness lies in the fact that the new leadership of the United States, the new administration of the United States, has very clearly and frequently spoken about ending the war as soon as possible. And they started to manipulate. I mean, the Russians began to manipulate this topic. That is, they periodically throw out the idea of ending the war of the Trump administration. The Trump administration, however, grabs onto it. Thus, the Russians are stalling for time, aiming to prevent Ukraine from receiving any military aid from the United States under the guise of negotiations.
Russia allegedly claims it wants a ceasefire. However, there are currently the most battles on the front in recent months. The Ukrainian side also expects provocations from the occupiers.
It is clear that Putin is not interested in ending the war at this stage. He is obviously counting on achieving something more as a result of the hostilities. And in fact, this is how everything is developing.
The more Putin gets, the greater his appetites become. But unfortunately, not everyone understands this. In particular, some European leaders are blocking negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the European Union.
First and foremost, this concerns countries like Hungary and Slovakia, where the government led by Orban and Fico, respectively, takes a rather active anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian stance, at least within the framework of the European Union.
In their decisions, these countries are not guided by the interests of their own nation, but unfortunately aim to please Russia.
It's obvious that this is not for free, because for Fico, it's a matter of obtaining cheap oil and gas from Russia. Urban is also concerned about this. But besides that, another important issue for him is the completion of the Hungarian nuclear power plant. With the help of Russia, with the support of Russia, and with financial and other investments from Russia.
The United States has become closer to one of the sides in the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. However, sometimes the White House is close to withdrawing from mediation. This was stated by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as reported by journalists.
A feature of Trump's approach was that he primarily positioned himself not as someone who sides with Ukraine, but as a kind of mediator, which should simply achieve a ceasefire, as a mediator between the two sides of the conflict. But in reality, such an approach is incorrect, simply because Russia obviously has far more resources than Ukraine for waging war. Therefore, to simply level the playing field, Ukraine needs support from the West, from the civilized world. At the same time, Ukraine is a victim of aggression. Ukraine is a democratic country that has chosen European and Euro-Atlantic integration as its development vector. And this, again, cannot be ignored, as the Trump administration is trying to do.
Trump added that he and his advisors have had quite positive discussions in recent days regarding Ukraine and Russia against the backdrop of efforts to end the war between the countries. Nevertheless, Trump acknowledges that Russia is not satisfied with the Ukrainian territories it has already seized during the war. Moscow is striving for the complete capture of Ukraine.
Everything is burning. Saki, Belbek, Kacha have been blown up. A drone-bombed military facilities. Even the secret space reconnaissance base is on fire. The Kremlin is in shock. What are the consequences of the strikes? Meanwhile, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to drive the Russians out of Ukrainian territories. There has never been such a mess. Urgent details right now.
Explosions have occurred in Crimea. The peninsula was massively attacked by UAVs.
Oh, that's really close. Oh, right now.
This is a cone of two lines. This is a cone of two lines. Wow.
Drones visited Sevastopol. Eyewitnesses claimed that there were many explosions and that this is the largest attack on the city. Russian public pages report that the Kacha airfield was hit. Social media also reported strong explosions in Gvardeyskoye, where a military airbase is located. Monitoring public pages report an attack on a military unit and an ammunition depot. Local residents claim that fires started after the attack.
May 2nd. Good morning.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
In turn, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims that their air defense allegedly shot down 121 drones overnight.
These are the main bases of the Russian aerospace forces, which are used to carry out missile and bomb strikes on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, in both the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. In addition, strikes were carried out on the locations of anti-aircraft missile systems, which actively defend the main logistical components.
Meanwhile, the Russian dictator decided to show off his apartments in the Kremlin.
So, this is the apartment, right?
Yes, this is the apartment. As you can see, it's not far.
Well, he deliberately showed the route for Ukrainian drones, although surely just to divert attention from his bunkers, which he will never show. Moreover, the illegitimate president of the aggressor country may have changed his goals in the war against Ukraine in the short term, focusing on strengthening positions in the captured territories and saving Russia's economy. This is indicated by new intelligence data from the US and other Western countries, writes CNN.
Mistaken opinion. The intensification of clashes along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front indicates the opposite. In the last 3 days, there has been a sharp increase in the number of clashes. If previously there were recorded between 130 to 150 at most in the last 3 days, up to 200. Moreover, the intensification of hostilities in previously stable directions, this is Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. And this indicates that Putin is trying to achieve the goal of taking control of all 4 regions of Ukraine that have been incorporated into the Russian Federation.
According to the analysis of American analysts, at the current pace of advancement, the Kremlin would need centuries and tens of millions of casualties to fully capture Ukraine. In April alone, they lost almost 5,000 pieces of equipment and more than 36,000 killed and wounded military personnel.
In the fourth year of the large-scale invasion by Russian occupiers, even the tactical level objectives of the so-called special military operation have not been achieved. That is, the capture of all territories of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Currently, the defense forces of Ukraine control about 35% of the territory of the Donetsk region, which indicates a political, military, and informational defeat for Putin personally, and consequently the Russian army. Moreover, it should be noted that the losses are catastrophic, even for the Russian Federation. Approximately 1 million Turmoil personnel of the armed forces of the Russian Federation.
Meanwhile, Russia continues to reject proposals from the US and Europe to deploy Western peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, as well as calls for territorial concessions for the sake of lasting peace. The Secretary of the Security Council of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, stated that the Kremlin would consider Western peacekeeping contingents in Ukraine as legitimate military targets.
Yes, there is a simulation of a negotiation process. Moreover, the so-called peace initiatives both the previous two and the one in May, are essentially aimed at creating conditions for the redeployment of personnel to further increase pressure on the positions of Ukraine's defense forces. Putin has not abandoned plans to capture territories controlled by Ukraine's defense forces, namely the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the production of 30-kilometer fiber optic spools for drones has begun. All of them have convenient quick-release mounts and easily integrate with drones of different types.
Pokrovsky, hell. The situation on the front is on the edge. Russia is throwing the remnants of its forces to break through to the Dnipro by May 9th. Almost 1 million losses already, but the Kremlin does not stop. Alaudinov demands the mobilization of another 1 million. And Shoigu has suddenly returned to the game. What is happening on the front line, and is Ukraine ready for a new strike? All the details in this episode.
Ukrainian Special Operations Forces destroyed a platoon of North Korean soldiers in close combat in the Kursk region. This event took place last month. However, for security reasons, our military can only talk about it now. Neutralized with no chance of recovery. In the north, border guards turned an enemy radar station to ashes with FPV drone strikes. -10 near Volchansk. The border guards of the Guard Brigade delivered precise strikes on enemy positions, destroying dozens of occupiers and communication antennas. Gradually, the losses of the occupiers in the war against Ukraine are approaching 1 million. In the last day, the Russian army lost 1,060 soldiers at the front, along with 5 armored combat vehicles, 3 tanks, and nearly 50 artillery systems.
This process, we're talking about the mass destruction of Russian servicemen by the Russian military command, could go on indefinitely. They are using tactics from the Second World War, the so-called Zhukovshchina, that is using numerical superiority as the main component to achieve both tactical and strategic goals.
But despite the fact that the Russians have already significantly mobilized for the war, there are not enough people at the front. Alaudinov, a well-known military failure, suggested to Putin to draft another 1 million people for slaughter.
The European states, with their 2 boats, 3 motorcycles, and 2 bicycles, trying to threaten us, would immediately back down.
But it seems that even the Kremlin dictator is no longer listening to this nonsense.
Of course, if we had a resource of 1 million people behind us that we could deploy at any time, no one would dare to flaunt their bravado, so to speak. They would all be eager to do anything just to prevent us from reaching them with that 1 million. This is my opinion. But for me, the opinion of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief is paramount, because it is his decision.
Despite colossal losses, the Russian army does not abandon the manic idea of reaching the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region.
The possibility of reaching the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions was reported as early as January. A notoriously known German journalist, Julian Röpke, reported sensational details at the time, estimating that there were 6 to 7 kilometers left to the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region as of now, the end of April. And as we can see, these kilometers have become a thorn in the side for the Russians.
Not calming down in any way, everything indicates that the occupiers are preparing for another offensive at the administrative border of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, reports the Ukrainian tactical group, Ugledar.
Currently, the Ukrainian defense forces are conducting a series of stabilization measures in the Pokrovsk direction, on both flanks, effectively nullifying the possibility of an operational encirclement of the Ukrainian group and practically eliminating the issue of a breakthrough by Russian occupation forces directly to the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region.
Against the backdrop of the Russian army's offensive actions, the information that Putin is ready to stop the full-scale invasion of Ukraine at the current front line, as part of efforts to reach a peace agreement with the head of the White House, Donald Trump, looks like an outright bluff. After all, Trump's promises do not mean the end of the war and the killing of civilians, and Ukraine is convinced of this every day.
That's all for now. But for more fiery news from the front, tune in to the next episode.